During World War II, the map of Europe was reshaped, not only on land, but also at sea. Front lines shifted, coastal towns changed hands, and small ports once dedicated to trade and fishing suddenly became military assets, only to vanish from operational reports just as abruptly. One such port was located in a secluded northern bay, sheltered by cliffs and persistent fog. Officially, it was classified as secondary, auxiliary, marked on military charts by a simple symbol with no additional notes. At the start of the war, it was an ordinary working harbor. A short pier, a coal storage shed, a few warehouse structures, and narrow rail tracks for small cargo platforms. Cargo ships arrived irregularly, mostly for timber and fish. Local residents lived their quiet routine. Short summers, long winters, rare vessels, and the constant creak of ropes against masts. But when naval conflict intensified, the quiet bay gained unexpected significance. Military engineers recognized the advantage of its terrain and the concealment offered by the narrow entrance. Here, small ships and barges could be hidden, repaired, and loaded with supplies without being detected by enemy reconnaissance aircraft. Civilian traffic disappeared quickly. In its place came military transports, patrol boats, and landing barges. New structures rose along the waterfront: workshops, fuel tanks, additional storage units. The port became a transfer point for military equipment arriving by sea. Temporary staging areas were filled with armored carriers, light tanks, trucks, and artillery tractors waiting to be shipped to the front. Rail platforms rolled along the pier with crates of ammunition and spare parts. Yet the port remained officially secondary. Larger naval bases attracted the attention of headquarters, aviation, and enemy intelligence. Reports described the small harbor with the words auxiliary, reserve, temporary. No one considered this bay a location capable of influencing the greater course of operations. It functioned quietly in the background, handling streams of equipment, men, and cargo known only to a limited circle of supply officers. The situation changed when the fighting intensified in the region. The front line moved dangerously close to the coast. Ships found it increasingly risky to enter major ports under constant enemy surveillance. Only then did commanders remember the secluded bay. Traffic surged dramatically. Trains brought armored vehicles to the harbor, where they were transferred to platforms and then to landing barges. At night, dark silhouettes moved across the water, accompanied by the muted clatter of metal on wooden ramps. Under the dim glow of a few lamps, the coastline seemed distorted and uncanny. The increased workload brought new risks. The harbor entrance was fortified with mines, camouflage nets, and anti-torpedo barriers. Light anti-aircraft posts were installed along the shore, and observation points were established on the cliffs. Yet even these precautions could not fully eliminate the threat of an airstrike or a fast torpedo boat raid. With every passing month, the atmosphere grew more tense. Ship crews avoided staying in the port longer than necessary, and work teams operated at maximum pace. Loading and unloading military equipment is always hazardous. The small landing barges, often overloaded with vehicles and ammunition, were especially vulnerable. Strong swells, miscalculations, mechanical failures, or simple human error could capsize a vessel right at the pier. Reports mentioned incidents of barges listing during unloading, their decks swallowed by incoming water, dragging entire loads under the surface. Such accidents were recorded in logs, but rarely discussed outside technical circles. Equipment was deemed lost, a short note explained the incident, and operations continued without pause. At the same time, the coastal waters became increasingly dangerous due to enemy submarines. Operating along the shoreline, they targeted small convoys and isolated transports. Some vessels, failing to reach larger bases, attempted to seek refuge in hidden bays like this one. Not all succeeded. A number were sunk near the harbor entrance, sometimes within sight of the pier. In the dense morning fog, only smoking masts and patches of churned water remained as fleeting evidence of their destruction. By the midpoint of the war, the seabed of the bay already held the first remnants of these events. Capsized barges lost during chaotic loading, small minesweepers sunk by storms or explosions, and damaged vessels abandoned after heavy hits. Inside their holds lay cargo that had never been unloaded, trucks, light armored vehicles, ammunition crates. Official records acknowledged these losses, but the overwhelming scale of the war reduced them to mere numbers. The port continued to operate, but its fate was sealed. As strategic routes shifted and supply chains rerouted to other regions, the bay once again faded into obscurity. Infrastructure was partially dismantled, partially destroyed during withdrawal operations. The pier fell empty, warehouses were sealed or blown up, and rail lines rusted away. To an outside observer, it became just another abandoned wartime site. But beneath its calm surface, between rusted pilings and the quiet hulls of derelict barges, an entire underwater graveyard was forming. Dozens of machines, guns, and support vehicles lay scattered on the seabed, creating a dense layer of submerged wartime remains. For those who worked there, these were simply entries in loss reports, technical points on a list. No one at the time considered them a singular phenomenon, much less a future historical discovery. The story of this port, like many others, seemed predictable. A period of intense use, gradual decline, and eventual abandonment. Yet it was precisely this abandonment that allowed the legend of a forgotten wartime harbor to form a harbor beneath whose waters rested dozens of sunken military vehicles, forming a silent but striking monument to an era of total war, where every piece of equipment was valuable, yet could vanish without a trace. As the war pressed on, the once busy auxiliary port began to lose its strategic relevance. The front shifted inland, naval routes changed, and the coastal region gradually turned into a quiet, overlooked zone. The port, which just months earlier worked day and night, now experienced long pauses between incoming transports. Warehouses stood half empty, cranes remained motionless in the fog, and the metallic echo of machinery faded from the shoreline. But while activity on the surface decreased, the seabed beneath the harbor continued accumulating remnants of wartime operations. Each incident, each sunken barge, each damaged transport contributed to a growing underwater archive of abandoned equipment. The decline began gradually. Supply officers were reassigned, and several warehouses were boarded up. Only minimal personnel remained maintenance crews, a small guard detachment, and a handful of mechanics tasked with preserving operational readiness in case of sudden need. Yet everyone understood that the port's importance was fading. Major naval operations had shifted far away, and new fortified harbors absorbed the traffic that once passed through this narrow bay. Still, even in its quieter state, the port remained a dangerous logistical point. Old equipment, weakened by months of intense use, frequently malfunctioned. Barges cracked at the seams. Engines failed at the worst possible moments. Some transports, attempting to anchor during storms, smashed into submerged rocks and sank within minutes. Such accidents were documented, but with diminishing attention. The war's scale overshadowed local losses. In several cases, transport ships arrived heavily damaged after skirmishes offshore. Their captains, aiming to save what remained, sought shelter in the bay. Not all managed to hold together. Some vessels slipped beneath the waves as soon as they reached calmer waters. Crews were rescued, but the ships, along with their cargo, remained on the seabed. Inside them were trucks, artillery pieces, fuel barrels, and machinery destined for frontline units now forever locked in rusting metal chambers. Meanwhile, The port's infrastructure continued deteriorating. Rails warped from corrosion. Wooden piers weakened. Storage sheds, once filled with spare parts and tools, stood cold and empty, their roofs rattling in the coastal wind. No one invested in repairs. No one expected the port to return to full capacity. Its role was reduced to the bare minimum, a fallback shelter, used only when other options failed. Local waters remained hazardous due to mines. Although most minefields were charted, storms and currents sometimes carried explosives into shallow areas. Several small naval vessels tasked with clearing mines never returned to the pier. Their broken remains settled near the harbor entrance, adding to the growing underwater clutter. The quietness of the port created an eerie contrast to the intense fighting occurring elsewhere. Guards on night duty described hearing the groaning of old hulls from beneath the waterline, as if the sea carried echoes of the machinery trapped below. During low tide, parts of rusted structures protruded above the surface. Steel beams, smashed plating, twisted railings. They hinted at the larger, unseen mass resting just meters deeper. By now, dozens of military vehicles had accumulated on the seabed, lost not through battle, but through logistical chaos, hurried decisions, and the stress of wartime operations. There were light tanks that had slid off unstable ramps, armored cars that sank inside barges, and even half-disassembled vehicles awaiting repairs when the platforms beneath them failed. Some rested upright, others lay overturned, their silhouettes slowly dissolving under algae and silt. Despite this, no attempt was made to recover them. Salvage operations required resources that the command preferred to direct elsewhere. In the hierarchy of wartime priorities, sunken equipment in a fading auxiliary port had no importance. The vehicles remained where they fell, gradually forming an accidental underwater collection of wartime engineering. As months passed, the last regular transport arrived, unloaded a small batch of supplies, and departed without ceremony. After that, the port fell into near silence. Only occasional patrol boats passed through, rarely staying more than a few hours. The guard detachment was reduced further. A few officers still kept administrative logs, noting minor incidents, but most records became routine and repetitive. The war moved on, while the port was left behind, suspended in a state between activity and abandonment. With each passing season, storms rearranged the debris below. Sand-buried wheel arches, mud-filled crew compartments, and sea life colonized every available surface. What once had been symbols of industrial war slowly transformed into dark, shapeless structures blending with the seabed. Yet despite erosion, the overall mass of machinery remained intact, a silent evidence of the port's frantic past. By the time the last remaining personnel were reassigned, the underwater landscape was already fully formed. Without knowing it, they left behind one of the densest wartime graveyards of equipment in the region, a place where the surface showed nothing but quiet waves, while beneath lay frozen remnants of a forgotten chapter of the war. Years after the war's end, the abandoned port remained a quiet, overlooked point on the coastline. The warehouses had collapsed, rusted rail lines disappeared under sand, and most locals viewed the area as nothing more than an empty stretch of shore. Storms reshaped the coastline. Vegetation reclaimed the concrete, and only fragments of metal occasionally surfaced after heavy waves, unremarkable to anyone who did not know the harbor's wartime past. Yet the underwater landscape stayed remarkably preserved. The cold waters, low salinity, and remote nature of the bay slowed corrosion. The vehicles resting at the bottom tanks, armored cars, trucks, and fragments of naval machinery retained their forms far better than expected. For decades, they remained untouched, hidden beneath a layer of silt and shadows, unnoticed by those who lived nearby. Interest in the forgotten port resurfaced gradually. A group of coastal engineers studying shoreline erosion first noticed anomalies on sonar readings large, dense clusters beneath the water. The shapes did not resemble natural rock formations. Soon after, oceanographic researchers from a nearby institute conducted a more detailed scan. To their surprise, the instruments painted a clear image: dozens of solid objects arranged irregularly across the seabed, some grouped tightly, others scattered along old underwater channels. Many were rectangular or angular, unlike any geological structure. The findings drew attention from military historians, who recognized patterns consistent with wartime vehicles. Old transport routes, documented only briefly, hinted that equipment had passed through the area. But the sheer number of submerged objects exceeded all expectations. What had once seemed like isolated wartime accidents now appeared to be part of a much larger picture. Divers were eventually deployed. As they descended into the cold, murky depths, they saw outlines emerging through the silt, first vague, then unmistakable. A barge lay on its side, its hull torn open. Inside, as the divers' light swept across, stood a row of rusted trucks, still arranged as if waiting to disembark. Some were almost fully intact, their shapes preserved in the oxygen-poor water. Deeper into the bay, more discoveries followed. A light tank rested upright, half buried, with its turret still attached. A nearby minesweeper's skeletal frame housed several collapsed vehicles that had once been secured on deck. Beneath piles of debris, divers identified what looked like artillery pieces, barrels protruding from mangled platforms, covered in marine growth. The scale of the site became evident after several weeks of mapping. The bay had effectively become an accidental wartime repository, a silent underwater archive, capturing a moment when logistical chaos, rushed evacuations, and enemy pressure converged. The port itself had been forgotten, but its submerged cargo remained as testimony. The divers noted a sense of eerie preservation. Some vehicles still had discernible markings, faint stenciled numbers visible beneath layers of corrosion. Wheels and tracks, though frozen in place, retained their structure. In several cases, cargo crates lay unopened near wrecks, their contents protected by thick wood and sediment. It was an archaeological landscape shaped not by intention, but by necessity and abandonment. Researchers concluded that the upper layers of the seabed held the most recent wartime losses: barges sunk in storms, transports damaged too severely to repair. Beneath them, older wrecks formed deeper layers, the earliest accidents from the port's busiest operational years. Over time, each loss settled on top of the last, creating a layered, almost stratified record of the war's logistical side. The findings ignited public interest. Documentarians and historians began investigating archive material. Many documents confirmed the presence of lost vessels and cargo, but none comprehensively described the full scale of the losses. Most entries were short: equipment unrecoverable, barge lost during storm, vehicle overboard during loading. Only when viewed together did the records reveal the magnitude of the port's wartime operations and its failures. The local government debated whether to raise any of the equipment. Salvage efforts were deemed too costly and potentially damaging to the underwater environment. Instead, the area was gradually recognized as a historical underwater site. Plans were drafted to protect it, restrict unauthorized diving, and preserve the submerged vehicles as a unique example of wartime maritime operations. As research continued, the forgotten port gained a new identity. Once dismissed as an insignificant location on wartime maps, it became a rare window into the logistical realities of the conflict. A place where equipment was not lost in battle, but through haste, weather, and the overwhelming demands of total war. The bay, quiet and unassuming at the surface, now held one of the largest accidental underwater collections of World War II military vehicles. It served as a reminder that history is shaped not only by grand strategies and famous battles, but also by overlooked places where the machinery of war quietly sank beneath the waves and remained there for decades, undisturbed and unseen. As the underwater site gained recognition, interest steadily grew among historians, divers, and military researchers. Yet the abandoned port itself remained quiet, its rusted beams, collapsed warehouses, and empty piers forming a stark contrast to the thriving archaeological work happening below. The bay, once a hurried wartime junction, had turned into a natural memorial shaped by time rather than intention. Researchers who visited the area remarked on the unique condition of the submerged vehicles. Cold waters had slowed decay so effectively that many objects remained identifiable even decades later. Tanks still showed the outlines of their turrets. Trucks retained cargo beds and fenders. Naval wrecks preserved the contours of their decks. It became clear that this was not just a scattered collection, but one of the densest surviving clusters of World War II equipment lost outside active battle zones. Historians began reconstructing the port's wartime activity through the underwater evidence. The arrangement of vehicles, the types of cargo, and the layered positions of wrecks revealed the intensity and disorder of operations during the war's critical years. Barges filled with equipment suggested hurried evacuations or rushed shipments. Overturned transports indicated accidents in storms or failed docking attempts. Taken together, the site painted a detailed picture of logistical strain that was never captured in official reports. As awareness grew, the port became a subject of documentary projects and museum exhibitions. Footage from divers showed haunting scenes. Silent tanks resting on the seabed, overgrown trucks surrounded by schools of fish, and twisted metal beams lying across silt-covered decks. It was a stark reminder of the war's industrial machinery and how swiftly equipment could be abandoned when time and conditions allowed no alternatives. Preservation efforts intensified. The site was mapped in high resolution, and protective measures were introduced to prevent unauthorized salvaging. Rather than raising the vehicles, experts agreed that the underwater environment itself served as the best preservation medium. Lifting the wrecks would damage both the structures and the historical context they rested in. Leaving them in place meant maintaining a natural museum shaped by silt, cold water, and the slow passing of decades. For local communities, the discovery brought a new sense of identity. What had long been dismissed as a dead shoreline became a place of historical importance. The bay turned into a point of interest for researchers, a symbol of overlooked wartime stories, and a reminder that the war left traces in unexpected places far from front lines, yet just as meaningful. In time, the forgotten port gained recognition not for strategic victories or major operations, but for what it inadvertently preserved, an untouched cross-section of wartime logistics. Beneath quiet waves lay vehicles that never reached the front, ships that never returned to service, and equipment that slipped out of history until rediscovered decades later. Today, the bay remains calm, its surface giving no hint of the steel landscape below. The sunken vehicles rest silently, covered in marine growth, forming one of the most unusual underwater memorials of the war. They stand as evidence of the countless small losses absorbed by a global conflict, losses never mentioned in official histories, yet vital for understanding the scale and complexity of wartime supply systems. The abandoned port, once overlooked and forgotten, ultimately revealed itself as a rare historical archive. Beneath its waters lies a frozen fragment of the past. Dozens of machines preserved by chance, telling a story not of battles fought, but of the relentless, unseen machinery that sustained a world at war.